Have you ever wondered why the same patterns keep appearing in our stories, whether it's a 2,000-year-old biblical tale or a modern blockbuster like Inception? What if I told you that both the creation story of the world and Cobb's journey into the unconscious in Inception are both part of the same ancient process, a process that has shaped human consciousness for millennia? This strange recurring pattern is an archetypal process which contains 3 stages of transformation. The first stage is chaos and disintegration. The second stage is purification and clarification, and the third stage is perfection. In Genesis, we start with the primordial chaos and darkness, which develops into the shaping and forming of the world, and culminates with the perfected creation of man in the image of God, the 3 stages of creation. We see the same pattern with Cobb from Inception. His inner and outer life is in chaos after his wife's death. He then starts to sort through the inner chaos and guilt that has been haunting him, eventually overcoming this and being reunited with his family, a free man. So how was this archetypal process identified, and perhaps most importantly, what on earth does it imply about the deep recesses of our minds? You're watching Archetypal Wisdom. Join me in exploring the symbolic truths and mysteries of humankind. Remember to like and subscribe. Now, back to the video. The 3 stages I outlined earlier stem from the ancient art of alchemy and what was referred to as the opus, or the work. Now, alchemy goes all the way back to ancient Egypt and has had a truly fascinating journey throughout the ages. Its original focus was the transformation of lead into gold. However, the practice was layered. It both centered around the transformation of matter and also symbolized spiritual transformation. The essential alchemical process continued and evolved throughout the ages. From Egypt, it entered into Hellenistic Greece, then it developed into Islamic alchemy, then into medieval Europe, merging with Christian mysticism, then into the Renaissance, until eventually during the scientific revolution it became modern chemistry. Now, what is fascinating about this is that during all of its incarnations it seemed to contain both a physical and spiritual significance. The process itself seemed loaded with both until the scientific revolution. At this point it seemed as if the spiritual component was dismissed, that is, until the brilliant Carl Jung came along and investigated it again more closely. He revitalized the symbolic aspect of alchemy through a psychological lens. He recognized that it is packed with psychic symbolism, hence the ancient pattern of it containing both physical and spiritual significance. Through this psychological lens, Jung recognized that alchemy outlines the fundamental process of psychological development, which he called individuation. So what was exactly happening in the physical process of alchemy that seemed to mirror deep psychological processes? Well, first there was the base metal, which was burned and broken down into its core essential elements. This was the stage of disintegration and chaos. Then there was the second stage of purification and clarification, which was the sorting through the essential broken down elements and cleaning them. This was to separate the impurities, leaving only the best aspects of the core elements. Then the final stage, which was the transformation into perfection, was putting together all the best parts of the elements to create a perfected form, gold. Now, this was recognized as being exactly the same process as psychological transformation. First, the ego, the conscious part of the personality, is broken down. It falls into a state of disintegration and chaos. This is essentially the confrontation with the unconscious, that which hasn't been recognized or integrated by the ego. The ego then goes through a process of sorting through all these different pieces of the psyche which have been buried. It sorts through them, seeing what can be integrated. Then it goes through the process of integrating the hidden unconscious qualities of the psyche that are important and vital. Thus the ego reforms with the new parts integrated, essentially going through a rebirth. So with all this in mind, let's now take another look at the Genesis story. In the beginning we have the dark void of earth, which is in a formless and empty state. This correlates with the first stage of disintegration and chaos. The Spirit of God hovers above the waters and starts to go through the dark void, creating shape and form, seeing that it is good. This is the same process of purification, sorting through the chaos and finding and clarifying what is good. Then, as the world takes shape and form, it culminates with the creation of Adam. Now, before the fall, Adam is perfect, created in the image of God and living in harmony with the Divine Father, corresponding with the final stage of perfection. So we have the same 3 stages, and this is the first incarnation of them in the biblical story. In fact, this process seems to repeat itself throughout the scripture in greater and more complex detail, which speaks to the eternal nature of this creation process and the eternal nature of individuation as a psychological process also. So how does this process repeat itself in greater detail? Well, you then have the fall of man, which starts the process of disintegration again. Then, over many generations, you have the development of prophets, which continues the process of purification. They are trying to sort through the human condition and reconnect with the divine source of perfection. This culminates in the arrival of Jesus, which repeats the final stage of perfection. He is the perfected form of both divine and human. Then the process starts over again with the crucifixion, the fall into chaos, the purification process through the prayer of forgiveness for humanity, then the perfection through the resurrection, now being reborn as an eternal being, an entry point for humanity to reconnect to the perfect divine source. Just as the Genesis creation story through to the crucifixion reveals the stages of chaos, purification, and perfection, this archetypal process isn't limited to ancient scripture. As I mentioned earlier, we see the same structure in modern narratives like Inception. Cobb's journey, while unique to his world, mirrors the same psychological stages found in biblical scripture. Let's explore how his path from chaos to reunification echoes this ancient process. We have our protagonist, Cobb, whose life is truly in a state of chaos. He has a specialized set of skills which involves infiltrating people's unconscious through shared dreaming. However, due to the tragic death of his wife, which has been falsely laid at his feet, he is on the run from a very powerful company and is in exile from his own country. He is given the opportunity for redemption and to return to his home if he can pull off an incredibly hard job. In a synchronistic poetry of storytelling, the job itself is Inception, which is the planting of an idea in someone else's mind. This is the very thing that he did to his wife. He planted an idea in her mind to try and help her, but eventually it drove her to her death. In other words, it forces him to face the past and that which led to the chaos and tragedy. As Cobb begins the job, it requires him to go deeper into the layers of his unconscious, this being the stage of purification. He is forced to reckon with the deep levels of grief and guilt he carries about his wife's death. He has to sort through what really happened and face the finality of his loss. He is forced to reckon with the fact that she haunts his unconscious, and this is actually what threatens the success of the job that will take him home to his children. He's eventually able to overcome this, recognizing that his projection of his wife doesn't aptly capture her in all the rich color of real life. He lets go of the guilt and this warped projection of his wife that plagues his mind. This results in him successfully completing the job, entering into the final alchemical stage of perfection, the healing of his fractured psyche and the reunification with his family and home. This three-stage archetypal process repeats itself over and over, and while the physical process of alchemy led to the revelation of chemistry, its symbolic representation is still very alive within the collective psyche. This is why the process continues to be outlined in stories to this day. In fact, this three-stage process is really at the core of the hero's journey. In the hero's journey, the protagonist is living beneath their potential. They fall into chaos through trials and tribulations, which eventually compel a transformation and development of the protagonist into the archetype of the hero. This timeless process also speaks to the depth of biblical scripture and the eternal truths that are loaded into the pages. The eternal nature of these stories and the process it outlines speaks to its psychological truth and explains its recurring resonance. It makes perfect sense that these stories would have such a hold on us because they teach, consciously or unconsciously, how to develop and face the world. They teach us how to live. The hero in the process of alchemical transformation symbolize the development of the ego, the conscious part of the human psyche, being broken down in its trials and tribulations and being forced to grow and develop, becoming more than it was previously. It is destined for a life of continuous deaths and rebirths. Each of us as we develop must be willing to face the intimidating depths of the unconscious. We must confront the shadow, the repressed and feared parts of the psyche, and reclaim and integrate what we can. We must continuously go through this purification, which takes great moral effort. We have to be willing to face that which terrifies us within ourselves and clean it to find what can be salvaged, where the potential is within it that can be integrated into our personality. In fact, this entire process is driven by what Jung called the archetype of the self, which is the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious. The ego sits within the totality of the self and is compelled to integrate more of it over a lifetime. This is the psychological equivalent of being made in the image of God. As the ego goes through the continuous death and rebirth process, it is essentially integrating more of the unconscious and thus more closely reflects the complete and perfect self-archetype. In fact, in the symbolic and more philosophical incarnations of alchemy, this is the pursuit of the philosopher's stone, which Jung believed was one of many symbols of the self. This is the symbolic counterpart of the gold that was being pursued on the physical plane. The philosopher's stone is the psychological equivalent of enlightenment, which correlates with the spiritual boon of the hero's journey. This is the timeless development of the psyche that is both universal and deeply personal. It reflects the macro and the micro. It reminds us that this is our great task, and while it is an individual journey in the truest sense, it is the process that unites us. You've been watching Archetypal Wisdom. Remember to like and subscribe. Stay wise.